Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. We recently looked at 5 of the best cavalry charges depicted in film, and today we thought we'd do the same thing, but about the 10 dumbest cavalry charges depicted in film. Let's go. When Finn meets up with Janna and a group of escaped First Order stormtroopers, it really got me excited. First Order stormtroopers were supposed to be a much better trained and smarter version of the Empire stormtroopers. It'd be really cool to see these former elite soldiers operate on behalf of the Resistance and their fight against old Palpy McScrotumface and his copy-paste Imperial Star Destroyer fleet. During the Battle of Exegol, Finn was in charge of the ground forces. His job was to disable the navigation signal that was in control of the entire fleet of enemy ships. Don't know why all the ships are slave to just one vessel. Seems like a classic Palpatine mistake of putting all your eggs in one basket. Now Finn, who we finally find out has the Force and not just some good intel, finds the navigational signal, and instead of just calling in an airstrike to take it out, he decides to carry out a good old-fashioned ground assault.
You want to launch a ground invasion on a Star Destroyer?
That A-Wing pilot is right to challenge Finn. I love the guy, but sometimes it's hard to take the infantry out of the grunt. And instead of landing his ships right on top of the nav signal, Finn and his assault force land several hundred meters on the opposite side of the ship so that they can carry out an epic cavalry charge on the backs of a bunch of Orbaks. Look, this is an amazing scene from a visual standpoint. You got BB-8 leading the charge, Sith jetpack troopers flying around. But why, guys? Just use a proton torpedo. It'll save a lot of lives. While man has been organizing stupid cavalry charges as long as man has been riding horses, the Charge of the Light Brigade, a poem written by Alfred Tennyson, is one of the most famous depictions of the futility of a frontal cavalry charge against fortified positions. During the Crimean War at the Battle of Balaclava, the famous British Light Cavalry Brigade is commanded to charge against Russian infantry who are stealing British cannons. The film The Charge of the Light Brigade does a really good job at satirizing and highlighting the confusion and arrogance of the British officers in command of this operation.
Lord Luke and the cavalry will advance on the Russians immediately. Along
with the eagerness of some of these officers to ride directly into the face of death.
We're going, dear friend. Permission to ride with the 17th.
Permission granted, dear friend.
While some more seasoned officers seem to be confused by the orders given to them.
But allow me to point out to you that the Russians have guns in the valley and batteries and riflemen on each flank. It is contrary to all practice of war for cavalry to charge artillery from the front.
They should have listened to these wiser officers, because the Charge of the Light Brigade remains one of the best cautionary tales of terrible military leadership and miscommunication on the battlefield. Out of the 600 men deployed during this battle, 110 were killed and another 161 were wounded. The Light Brigade's ill-advised charge in the wrong direction would take them directly into a valley surrounded on 3 sides by Russian soldiers armed with rifles and cannons. When it comes to fictional and fantastical cavalry forces, the Dothraki horde certainly have built themselves quite a reputation. These harsh nomadic warriors travel across the great Dothraki Sea on their majestic mounts, and everyone bows in fear to their might. But from a military standpoint, what exactly do the Dothraki horde have on their side? Well, in my opinion, a lot of toxic masculinity. Now forget about the feminist definition of toxic masculinity. The real definition of toxic masculinity is stupid things you think are manly, but that are actually very likely to get you killed. Like going shirtless into battle without any armor or shields. This is toxic masculinity. Being so lightly armored and relying mainly on short-range auroch blades to do battle on the back of a horse is also toxic masculinity. Charging straight forward into a line of heavily armored Lannister spearmen who are braced for impact is also toxic masculinity. The only reason the Dothraki win this battle is because they have a freaking dragon on their side. The Dothraki don't make any sense. They should either be lightly armored horse archers or more heavily armored lancers. Like the Asian steppe horsemen they are obviously modeled after. Instead, these are essentially berserkers who just happen to ride horses around. The Dothraki do a lot of dumb and regressive things all throughout the Game of Thrones, but by far the dumbest charge we see the Dothraki get involved in is during the Battle of Winterfell. The Red Witch lights all of their aurochs on fire, which makes these very simple to please Dothraki very happy. Once their blades are all lit, the Dothraki attempt a suicidal frontal charge against a massive wave of White Walkers. They all get wiped out. Game of Thrones was so disappointing. When the steward of Gondor, Denethor II, found out that his eldest son Boromir had fallen in battle, he fell deep into grief. He knew that Minas Tirith and Gondor would soon fall as well. He had stared into the heart of darkness itself when he used the Palantir to spy on Sauron. In his grief, Denethor would question his younger son Faramir's loyalty. He would command him to do the impossible, retake the heavily orc-guarded garrison of Osgiliath with just 100 mounted knights. One does not simply stroll across the fields of Pelennor and retake Osgiliath with a squadron of knights. It's suicidal, and none of Faramir's knights even make it close to the city before they're intercepted by a wall of arrows. Now, American Ben is going to kill me for this because this is basically his favorite movie, and he models his own life after Tom Cruise in feudal Japan. But that charge in The Last Samurai at the end of the film was spectacularly stupid. The only people who would glorify a bunch of horsemen charging into a Gatling gun are the same type of people who need to convince others to charge into a Gatling gun. Don't ever trust an officer who glorifies death. He's full of bullshit, and this is why most militaries prey on the young and the brave for service. Katsumoto and his men are a sign of the old way in Japan. They stand in the face of Western modernization, a modernization that would one day propel Japan ahead of all of its regional rivals, including their massive and previously dominant neighbors Russia and China. I mean, do you really want your country's military run by a bunch of regressive warriors who are too stupid to curb their ego to stay alive in battle? A good soldier should put his nation and, more importantly, his fellow comrades in arms before their own personal ego. The fact that Katsumoto lost almost all of his men in this unnecessary charge and then decides to take the coward's way out by doing a seppuku makes me understand exactly what his samurai values mean. Absolutely nothing. The story of Warhorse follows a British horse and the death of innocents that was rampant during World War I. Modern technology like machine guns, artillery, gas, and tanks would turn the battlefields of Europe into a living hell. In one of the scenes in Warhorse, we see a group of British soldiers mount their horses in the cover of some wheat fields. They prepare themselves for a full-on frontal assault. Like the young men in the Light Brigade, many of these horsemen do not fully understand the horrors that await them. At first, they ride through a camp of surprised enemy soldiers that are running around in chaos. They manage to inflict a great amount of casualties. But when the horsemen reach the edge of the camp, they meet a bunch of Germans in prepared fighting positions with heavy machine guns. Quickly, the British charge turns into a massacre. Charges like this actually did occur in the first moments of World War I before the massive trenches on the Western Front were erected. But British cavalry soldiers were mainly used as scouts, and most of the time these horsemen would dismount once they reached the battlefield and fight like any other infantry soldier. It was very well known amongst the men what would happen if horses charged directly at machine guns. Being a hero and being dumb are not mutually exclusive. In the film Kingdom of Heaven, a simple crusader by the name of Balian witnesses an incoming Saracen army that is chasing innocent civilians who are running towards the castle of Kerak for shelter. Balian, who is in control of a small unit of armored knights, decides to cover the refugees as they flee.
We cannot attack that and leave.
Balian and his men fully understand how dumb this maneuver is, but sometimes when you're a hero and trying to save other people's lives, you must do dumb things in order to achieve your goal. Balian's small unit of knights creates a double wedge and charges directly into thousands of Saracen horsemen, and they're immediately swallowed up by their mass. The good news is the Saracen leader is so moved by Balian and his men's heroics that he decides to let them live and fight another day. The brave riders of Rohan have pulled off some of the most majestic cavalry charges in the history of Middle-earth. They relieved their unbeleaguered king at the Battle of Helm's Deep, and later they would sweep a massive portion of Sauron's army from the walls of Minas Tirith. But after that initial successful charge, the riders of Rohan would find themselves facing a gigantic force of Mumakil on the fields of Pelennor. The good King Theoden is overwhelmed by the sight of these massive beasts, many times larger than elephants in our world. And against his own better judgment, Theoden decides to reform the Rohirrim lines and directly charge into these massive beasts. The riders of Rohan, however, have no weapons capable of taking down one of these massive beasts. And so the second these two lines meet, The heroic yells of the riders of Rohan turn into the horrified screams of their horses and men being flung hundreds of feet into the air by the giant tusks of the Mumakil. Avatar is the only movie on our list where the horse-riding soldiers are actively abusing their mounts through some kind of weird type of connection to their animal that most likely is a new form of bestiality. In an attempt to push off the peaceful humans of the Resource Development Administration, the Na'vi carry out a multiple-pronged attack against their security forces. Riding gigantic dire horses, a group of Na'vi warriors attempt to charge a line of human soldiers equipped with modern automatic firearms and exoskeletons. The results are not surprising. Despite their much larger size, the Na'vi are completely wiped out during this frontal assault and forced to retreat. Our next and last cavalry charge is again caused by English arrogance. In the film Braveheart, during the Battle of Stirling, a massive English military force confronts a small band of Scottish rebels underneath the command of William Wallace. The Scots have no real heavy cavalry and are not deemed the major threat in this battle, because shock cavalry is essentially the modern equivalent of tanks on the battlefield during this time period. The English, after launching just a few volleys of arrows, decide to use their shock cavalry to mount a devastating frontal charge against the thickened Scottish lines. A force of fully armored horses with lance-equipped knights riding on top of them was a devastating sight. But even then, these types of units rarely did frontal attacks, and usually if they do frontal attacks, it's against thin lines of soldiers that can be easily broken. Not only are the Scots tightly packed in formation, they also have hidden a bunch of wooden staves, which they pick up at the last moment and use to slaughter the enemy charge. So the one mistake we see getting repeated time and time again is commanders believing too much in the power of his own unit and carrying out frontal assaults. One should never carry out a frontal assault if they don't have to. That is a lesson we can apply to almost everything in life. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.